All right, welcome to the Transfigured Life. I know you guys are probably wondering why I'm wearing shades, got a little eye damage, but it's not about me. But we have a special guest in the
Dog life.
building. No goons out here. But I'm here. I'm met with Father Jonathan, Archpriest, 30 years. And how you doing, Father?
I'm doing great. Good to see you.
Yeah.
Sorry about your eye. I had the same problem a week ago. Hope you're better soon.
Thanks, man. Yeah, no worries, no worries. And we have a special guest in the building, the one and only. And I know he's not a fan of all this extra stuff, but Father, when we actually had a debate about a year ago, we sought his counsel and wisdom. We were looking for, the Orthodox guru of apologetics, and the thing about Perry Robinson people don't know is he's like the sensei when it comes to Orthodox apologetics. He doesn't put himself out there like that, but the young lads come to him to inquire about wisdom, and he's like, "All right, come for Ninja Turtles. Like you can glean from me when you want." And that's kind of who we get, what we're
That's
getting with
right.
Perry Robinson. You know what I mean? So please give it up for Perry Robinson. How are you doing,
The
Perry?
godfather of God talk. Here we go. All right.
Yeah, you're bringing out my Italian roots. You know, uh, no, I'm doing well.
Okay.
Thank you for having me. I was I was very happy to lend a hand with the debate you both did on Sola Scriptura. Um, that's something that I've wrestled with and studied. So I was very happy to help, and I'm happy to help other Orthodox apologists where I can and provide direction and support so that we can have a kind of united front, so to speak, and we can put out better quality material and
Mm.
have a good disposition and remove obstacles for people to come into the Church of Jesus Christ. So
Yeah.
I was very happy to lend a hand there. So thank you.
Thank you, Perry.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
have been
Thank you.
engaged in talks with a number of what I would call very key Orthodox folks. And quite often when we talk to or about Protestantism, the issue of apostolic succession comes up. And
Right.
we can make we feel we can make a very strong case for it, but Protestants are very vested in trying to tear down that case. So
Mm.
to
To
start off
have.
here, let me ask you, what is apostolic succession? Because some of our viewers may kind of have heard that term, really don't know what it is or what it means. What is it, and why is it important to our understanding of ecclesiology?
So let me start out by just saying what apostolic succession is not,
Mm.
because there's a lot of confusion about that. Um, so there's a couple different theses that sometimes get confused with it. So let me clear those away, and then I'll give a basic idea of what apostolic succession is as a thesis.
Right.
So the first idea that it's not is the idea of tactual succession. Tactual succession is the idea that you just have a line of one person touching the other. The touching doesn't actually do anything, but it's kind of a pedigree or a list. That's not the idea of apostolic succession. Now, apostolic succession includes the idea of listing and of
Mm.
touching. We'll get into that in terms of laying on of hands and ordination later.
Mm.
But that by itself is not the idea of apostolic succession. Then we have the idea of patrine succession associated with Catholicism. And sometimes this gets confused with apostolic succession. This would be the idea that the popes are successors of Peter, and all the bishops have to be in communion with the pope because he's got this chrism that's over and above being a bishop. That's not the idea of apostolic succession. Nor is apostolic succession a mere appeal to antiquity. So it's not appeal to, well, this is just the way that things have been done in the past, and so this is why we're doing it. If we were in the first century and the church had been established last week, it would still be important to have ministers who are commissioned by God. you wouldn't have a whole long line because the church had not been around longer than a week or a month or whatever. But you would still need to know, okay, these people were in fact commissioned by God. So the idea of apostolic succession is still, the principles of it are still operative in the New Testament period. So it doesn't require a long list. It's just that because the church has been around for 2 millennia, that the list, you need to have a list. So, and then the last thing that it's not is a particular diocesan structure. So sometimes in the scholarship, people will talk about the monarchical episcopate as part of apostolic succession. And the way this is interpreted is that you have one bishop in one locale. And so then the idea is, well, we don't have that in the New Testament or in early 2nd century. And so people will argue that the monarchical episcopate is a later development. But really, the idea of apostolic succession doesn't require a single bishop in a given location. It requires a different thesis. So you can have more than one bishop in a given diocesan location. There's no principled reason why you can't. And we'll talk a little bit, I think, later on about why that's so, and what really I think monarchical episcopate really amounts to. So if none of those things are apostolic succession, or they're just mere constituents or parts of the model or idea, well, what is it? I think taking the lead from an older Anglican scholar, Felix Surlot, who has just a fantastic book called Apostolic Succession, Is It True? He narrows it down to about 4 principles. So I'm cannibalizing his work at this point. So first is the idea that possession of a supernatural or divine power and authority is ultimately derived from God alone. Okay, that would be the first part of the idea. And second, that transmission of divine power and authority can be conveyed in greater or lesser degrees. So the conveyance of divine power and authority is a matter, can be a matter of degree. So when we look at the New Testament and we see the ordination of the deacons, we shouldn't think that just because the apostles ordained them that they're now apostles, right? So there's a degree of conveyance of divine power and authority to minister that's lesser than the apostles. The next idea would be that appointment or ordination, appointment to an office is ordinarily accomplished by ordination, the laying on of hands, and ordination conveyed a real spiritual power and authority, or supernatural power and authority. It wasn't a mere outward sign of something that was thought to be happening or contiguously occurring. The ordination actually conveys the spiritual power and authority from the originator to the recipient. So in short, that ordination actually does something. It's not just a mere titular act. It just doesn't convey a title. And this will be important later on.
Great.
The last principle of the idea of apostolic succession, and then I'll sum it up, is that not all powers of the highest office were transferred to all orders of the hierarchy. That is, only bishops have the power to ordain. So when we put all those principles together, what we get is the thesis of apostolic succession, that Christ and the apostles instituted ministers by divine power and authority in the church, and that the 3 orders of ministers were bishops, presbyters, and deacons, and bishops alone retained the power to ordain. Bishops and presbyters alone retained the power to offer the Eucharist and a few other things, and deacons being the lowest order. So, and that we have the idea of episcopacy, a threefold office of bishops, presbyters, and deacons, and that ordination conveys a real spiritual power and authority, and that ordinarily that power and authority doesn't come on somebody unless that they are ordained.
Mm.
So that I think is generally the idea of apostolic succession. It isn't the idea that we have modern day apostles like of the 12.
Right.
So we're not doing what some of the folks on TBN and I
Right.
don't even know if TBN's still around
With a
anymore.
cloth and
Yeah, no, we're not claiming modern day apostles of the first order like they seem to be.
Right.
So it's a succession of ministry, that the ministry that Christ and the apostles instituted is continuing through the church. It's not that the apostles died and then some just new kind of ministry outside the new covenant took over. This is a new covenant ministry. So that I think would be a general summation of what apostolic succession is and what it isn't.
Oh no, Perry, that's actually a really great point. Father Stephen DeYoung in his book, one of it, I believe it's his first book, Religion of the Apostles, he mentions this idea that, basically, when it comes to, the apostolic, line, it's not like what made an apostle was not just, seeing Christ, but seeing him in his uncreated glory. And so it's interesting that you mentioned like, hey, contrary to what TBN is saying here, it's not, there's a specific way we understood what an apostle was, and this is just the office, and it's understood in a different way. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Well, and then the other thing is that even when you have someone like Paul, who is called directly from Christ, the first thing is the first order apostles are verified by prophecy and miracle. And I know that the other more colorful people will claim that. But another thing is that Paul went up and has a kind of acceptance by the other apostles.
Right.
So the other apostles recognize him. I'm not sure how these other people on television and such could possibly fulfill that requirement, because they don't have any change. They're 19 centuries too late, or at this point, 20 centuries too late. So, it's not, you're right. It's not just viewing the ministry of Christ. It's seeing the resurrected Christ, but it's also in the book of Acts being accepted by the other apostles. And that's a condition I don't think that they can fulfill.
Mm, mm. So yeah, let me ask you, Perry. What would you say is the biblical grounds for apostolic succession? And I'm glad we're doing this episode because like the the Orthodox case, I feel like is a very strong case. And for anybody that's gonna be tuning in today, it'd be hard to leave this conversation, thinking otherwise. But we know that it's there historically. We know it's in the scriptures. What what would you say as far as with the scriptures, like what would you say is the biblical grounds, whether it's, text from the Old Testament or the New? What would you say about that?
Well, my comments here will be a little general, but I'll try to
Okay.
pick out things that people who have read the scriptures, I think, should recognize.
Mm,
With the Old Testament, with the institution of the Mosaic Covenant, you have two kinds of commissioning. You have extraordinary commissioning and ordinary commissioning. Extraordinary commissioning is when God directly calls you and verifies or authenticates your ministry by miracle and prophecy. So you see this with Moses and Aaron, right?
mhm.
I think we can all agree that the miracles that Moses works or God works through Moses, like that's pretty good verification, right? So just ask Pharaoh. Then you have people who are ordained by them when they set up the Levitical priesthood. And you have the high priest, you have the ministering priests under the high priest, and then you have the Levites. And so you have people then who are ordinarily commissioned. They are not directly commissioned by God, but they are commissioned by someone who was commissioned directly by God and whose ministry was authenticated. So we
Mm,
have the spring, if you will, and then we have the stream flowing from the spring, and we have a threefold ministry. We have the high priest, we have the priests, and we have the Levites. And this is important because this is how, for example, in Clement's epistles in the apostolic period or the apostolic fathers, he refers to these as the basis for the threefold ministry in the church. So it sets a precedent. Another thing that you have in the Old Testament is you have ordination through the laying on of hands and anointing with holy oil. And I think that's fairly uncontroversial. And then you get this rebellion at Korah, which I believe is in the book of Numbers, where you have the lower orders of ministers who are not allowed to go into the tent. So this is when Israel's still traversing in the wilderness. And they're a little peeved. They're like, well, we're doing work. Why can't we go in there? Right? We should be equal with these the next level up. They're, right? You're discriminating against us, kind of thing. And Moses begs them not to do this. And basically, I believe God opens up the earth, the crevasse in the earth, and swallows these other people up in condemnation for presumption of trying to take an office that did not belong to them. Okay. So even though they felt that they were being wronged, that did not legitimate them, taking the ministry to themselves. And this is why, for example, in the book of Hebrews, you have in Hebrews chapter 5, Hebrews says that no one takes the honor of the office to himself, but receives it when he is called by God, even as Aaron was. Okay, so you can't just stand up and say you're a minister according to the Bible. Okay, so we got Pastor Fred out there, or Pastor Chuck, or whoever else that says, well, I feel called by God. Well, goody for you. That doesn't make you a minister. And this is part of the issue, is what constitutes a minister. And that's part of the question that Apostolic Succession is addressing. So further going into the New Testament, the background would be Jesus comes to the apostles and says, as the Father sent me, so I send you. Right? And he breathes on them and he empowers them with the Holy Spirit. So we have this idea of sending, of commissioning, both in the Old Testament and also in the New Testament from the lips of Christ himself. And this is important because in the early church, there were two questions that were really important when you met somebody who was a professing Christian. And the two questions were, who sent you? And what is your teaching? And the first question was more important than the second. One, because Christianity was politically suppressed, and because you lived in a situation in the first century, 2 centuries, where you had people saying all kinds of stuff. You had various Gnostic sects, and they would say that they were Christians too. So you needed to be sent or commissioned by somebody in a known church. And you even see this in the book of Acts. You have Peter being sent by, I believe, the church at Antioch, which is interesting that the church is sending Peter. It's an interesting question for our Catholic friends. Peter's being directed by the church. But you have people in the New Testament being sent by a church, and they're bringing letters with them, right? And you see this even in Paul's epistles. Greet so-and-so that I am sending this letter with, and things like this. So this was very, very important. Who sent you? And you see this in Paul's epistle to the Romans, where he says, how shall they hear unless someone preaches? And how shall someone preach unless they are sent? So there's a commissioning very clearly in the New Testament of authorizing ministers, right? And there's a very clear testimony, I believe, that the commissioning included the laying on of hands, and that the commissioning conveyed a real spiritual power and gift. So it is the case that laying on of hands was used for many things, right? It can be for people after they were baptized for the receiving of the Holy Spirit. It can be for healing. It can be for a number of things. But that of itself does not preclude or exclude laying on of hands doing actual work in terms of ordination. So it's important to recognize, sure, laying on of hands was for many different things, but it was also for this thing over here, and this thing actually accomplished something. So some other highlights from the New Testament, Hebrews 7:7 says that without any dispute, the lesser is blessed by the greater. Okay, so in the scriptures, it's hierarchical, right? So the blessing comes from the top down. It doesn't come from somebody usurping or trying to make themselves a minister on their own. The New Testament knows nothing of people claiming to be ministers on their own.
Right.
And then there are two verses that I think are very important. One is 1 Timothy 4:14, and the other is 2 Timothy 1:6. So in 4:14, Paul says, "Do not neglect the spiritual gift," to Timothy, "within you, which was bestowed on you through the prophetic utterance with the laying on of hands by the presbytery." Okay, so the gift comes through the laying on of hands, and the gift is within him. So it's a spiritual gift. They didn't give him a chicken sandwich, right? Then in 2 Timothy 1:6, he says, "For this reason, I remind you to kindle afresh the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands." Now, this is important because our Presbyterian and Baptist friends will appeal to 1 Timothy 4:14 and say, well, see, it was the whole presbytery that laid hands. Well, if you've been to an Orthodox ordination and you see the bishop ordain someone, priests and deacons come lay their hands in a confirming manner, right? That does not negate that the source of the ordination is from the bishop. That's the first point to make. Second, in 2 Timothy 1:6, the construction there is very specific, that it comes through the laying on of Paul's hands.
Right.
The presbytery is in 1 Timothy 4 is acting, the construction there implies a confirming role. Like this is an act of the whole church, right? With Paul. So the third point I would make is that even if this were to support a Presbyterian or congregational polity, which I don't think it does, it entails and expresses a view that they deny, which is that ordination conveys a real spiritual gift and power. And this is something that our Protestant friends, I think the better sources and the more historically representative sources freely admit. You can pick up a Reformed systematic theology and look at their theology of ordination. And they're very clear that ordination is not a sacrament. It does not convey any spiritual gift. There's nothing that comes through the laying on of hands. And I'm very happy with that because I tell my Reformed friends, thank you for admitting that your ordinations do nothing, right? I mean, they don't convey anything, that your ministers are just laymen who have been democratically or in a Republican format elected to administer certain things. There's
no mystery in it.
Yeah, so they're just laymen. They've been authorized by the consent of the governed, and it's an entirely naturalistic, might want to say a kind of Pelagian ecclesiology that they have. So the Reformed and the other Protestant traditions are fairly clear that ordination, laying on of hands, is not a sacrament and it doesn't convey anything. So even if we had a Presbyterian polity just means church government, structure where you only had presbyters and deacons, it would still be the case that these passages express a view that contradicts their thesis. So I would point to those passages. Titus 1:5 is another passage. Paul says, "For this reason I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you." Okay. And we'll talk a little bit about what presbyteros means there in terms of elders or presbyter. But notice it's Timothy who's doing the ordaining. And if he were just a presbyter, all he would need to do would be ordain presbyters in one place and move on, because they could go on and do all the other ordaining. But they're not, right? They are, it requires Timothy to do the ordaining all throughout Crete, which really makes no sense if they were of equal rank with Timothy. right?
Right.
If they were just presbyters like he was, well, why can't they ordain? They're the same thing that he has. Well, apparently for Paul and Timothy, they can't do it. It requires Timothy to go around Crete, and Crete's not a really big place. All you have to do is go to Crete, you go to the island of Crete, and it's not that big. It wouldn't take them very long, but Timothy has to give something that the others can't give.
Mm.
So
This is fascinating, because you speak about the Protestants, and yet we've got the Anglicans out there saying that, well, we have apostolic succession. Of course, we don't recognize that, and the Roman Catholics don't recognize it. But the Roman Catholics, of course, claim to have apostolic succession. So what do we make of that? And would we have a more compelling case?
yeah, there's a number of things in the history. I'm a former Anglican. I was raised in the Episcopal Church before it went the way of all flesh, so to speak. So let me say what the issues are surrounding Anglican ordinations. The Orthodox Church has never formally recognized Anglican ordinations. So, and there's a bunch of literature in the 1850s to the 1930s. There was a substantial drive, an ecumenical drive for real dialogue and attempt at Christian unity. And the problem is you had high church Anglicans, more Catholic Anglicans, Catholic in ritual and theology, who were representing the Church of England to the Orthodox. And so the Orthodox are getting this, okay, well, they believe in sacraments, they believe in this, they've got all this other stuff. Okay, this sounds pretty good. And you also have to understand that, like, for example, the Church of Greece doesn't get its independence to what, Father, the 1830s or so?
The church, well, the war was 1821, and
Okay.
it wasn't right away. Yeah.
Yeah, so they're still under Turkish yoke, right? They're still recovering from Ottoman occupation well into the 19th century. So they get a really distorted picture of what the Church of England is composed of. And the Church of England is composed of basically three different theological perspectives, high church, broad church, and low church. And high church being the more Catholic in theology and ritual, Catholic meaning sacramental, sacerdotal, where sacerdotal just means a ministry of priests. You have a special order of ministers. Broad church would be more kind of Erastian and strong Lutheran influences, and low church would be very Calvinistic. Much less ritual, much less ornate dress, a more reformed theology of the sacraments. And that's because the Church of England was, over a period of time, a political compromise, which is why their formularies and the language of the prayer books and the missals were kept ambiguous at key points to accommodate different theological positions. Okay, so you have ambiguous terms that could be interpreted three different ways. So that's kind of the background there. Then in the late 19th century, there was a papal bull, Apostolic Curae, which declared Anglican orders null and void, utterly null and void. And the reason for this was because there was a claim that Archbishop Parker had been ordained as a joke in a bar. And this is called the Nag's Head fable, Nag's Head being the name of the bar where this supposedly took place. And that was one of the issues. The main issue, though, was that Rome claimed that Anglicans had a defect in intention. That is, they did not intend, when they ordained somebody, to convey a real spiritual power and authority. And there was a whole flurry of literature on Catholic and Anglican sides at the late 19th century, well into the to 1920 and 1930, defending the Anglican claim. I think, to be fair, the Anglicans can make a fair argument, but the horse has kind of left the barn, so to speak. One, because the low church interpretation is still possible, and that's going to, like, the low church position and the papal position agree, right? So the Anglicans were never able to exclude the low church interpretation. The other problem is that it's kind of a moot point at this juncture, because Anglicans have ordained women not just to the diaconate and the presbyterate, but to the episcopate as well. So that means anybody who is ordained by those people has no valid ministry at all on Orthodox grounds. And secondly, even if they were ordained by a man, the defect in intention is very clearly stated, because they think they can ordain women also. So we're at a point where the Church of England itself and many of its provinces, not all, but many, are so completely non-Christian in profession that any claim of apostolic succession rings hollow, right? They don't believe the theology of it. It's very clear in their practice. They reject. I mean, you can be an atheist, open atheist, and be a bishop in the Church of England. I'm not exaggerating. This is actually the case. So
it's wild.
So whatever the argument was is a matter of history. Okay. And even if you have more moderate bodies like the ACNA, the Anglican Church in North America, they still ordain women on a diocese by diocese basis, which means that they do not think that it's a theological difference. It's just a practical difference, which means they don't hold to the doctrine of apostolic succession. So they've kind of, knocked themselves out. They will bring up the doctrine when their funds are threatened. So for people who don't know, the Episcopal Church owns some of the land that Wall Street sits on. Okay, that land was given to the Episcopal Church before the United States government existed, because it was the Church of England. Right. And the church never sold off that property. The church has just leased it out successively until somebody decided to put Wall Street and stock exchange and those kinds of things there. So they have a hefty revenue. So a number of years ago, the liberal Presbyterians, PCUSA, and I think the liberal Lutherans, ELCA, were getting all ecumenical and wanted to have an interchangeability of ministers and reach full union with the Episcopal Church. Now, in principle, at this point, none of those three bodies should have a problem, because they're all functionally, in my opinion, Unitarian, with just different clothing. They really don't believe their distinctive theologies anymore. So why wouldn't they do it? Well, the Episcopal Church came back and said, well, none of you guys have apostolic succession. And I'm like, wait a minute. You have bishops who deny the Trinity, the resurrection, and all this other stuff, but you're invoking apostolic succession. Well, why? Well, to protect your assets, right? So it just came down to a convenient, reason, to not have unity with these other theologically liberal bodies. It wasn't because they really believed in apostolic succession at all. So I think the Anglican claim is kind of, they're fractured, and I'm not trying to be cruel or anything. I went through all of that in the continuing church movement. I understand the pain that those people suffer. I'm not trying to make light of it. So continuing churches are Anglican churches who broke away from the Episcopal Church sometime around the 1960s to 1980s, when ordination of women was being floated. There's about 14 of them, roughly speaking, and they're all over the place. You have low church like the Reformed Episcopal Church. You have high church like the Anglican Catholic Church. You have charismatic Episcopal Church. Right. Most of these are pretty small. They're between 5 and 20,000 members. When I was there, one of the issues was, well, you're supposed to be part of the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and we've got 5 bishops, and we're 3 coughs, a heart attack, and a stroke away from not having any ministers, right? This starts to undermine your confidence in the ordination and its existence as being a Church of Christ. So, and even the more moderate bodies like the ACNA still ordain women. So even if these others, like the Reformed Episcopal Church, the ACC, don't, I mean, the REC is low church, the ACC is high church. Which of them is Anglican? what is your theory of ministry? You won't get an agreement there. So I think that puts Anglicanism on the side. With Rome, and I would say like the Coptic Church, we have a different situation. So
Yeah.
with
We have a shared history in a way, you know.
we do, and we also do, to be fair, with the Anglicans in terms of prior to the 16th century, right? So I want to be realistic, and history is messy enterprise.
Yep.
But with the Coptic Church, you don't have a substantial change in practice like you do with the Anglicans. I think that their bishops, from my anecdotal experience, really believe in Jesus Christ. They really believe in the Holy Trinity, right? We have Christological differences with them. That's a long and involved and highly technical conversation. With the Catholic Church, we have other issues like the Filioque, the papacy, probably predestination, and a few other issues with them. And so I don't think in principle we disagree with either Rome or the Copts on the essence of apostolic succession. So in terms of the case that can be made, it's going to come down to, we understand that you've maintained this historical line, but apostolic succession is a necessary but not sufficient condition for being the Church of Jesus Christ. And so then the question of it moves to a second order issue of what constitutes right doctrine. So the ministry, in order to be a legitimate ministry as a body, has to convey proper doctrine. If you're ordained a bishop and you're a heretic, well, that kind of puts you on the outing. So the way to think about it would be, with respect to Protestants, is you have to be this tall to go on this ride, right? To be in the game of what constitutes a true church, you at least have to have a claim of apostolic ministry, that the ministry is sacerdotal, that it conveys a real spiritual power and gift.
I like that analogy.
Yeah. So if you don't even have the claim, you're not even on the bench.
Right.
You're not a player in the game, right? And there's really only three contenders, right? There's us, Orthodox, there's the non-Chalcedonians, and there's Rome.
Right.
So I would say there's not a principal difference in the essence of the idea of adherence to apostolic ministry, but that's going to move to another level. And then it's going to come down to a lot of overlapping and common historical sources for the actual documentation of who ordained who, right? So there are long lists in church history. Some of these are on the internet, where you can see the Patriarch of Jerusalem, right? Started with this apostle, was ordained by this, all the way down. In my own church, in the Antiochian church, we have this for the Church of Antioch. Rome has their list. Alexandria has theirs, and so on and so forth. And many non-principal sees like Thessaloniki or the Church of Crete, they have their list. So this would be like saying that we're all essentially on the same page in terms of documenting the lists. Another interesting thing, though, is that even though we have doctrinal differences with the Church of Rome, Roman Catholic Church still recognizes our orders and our sacraments as valid. So if a Catholic or an Orthodox clergy were to convert, they don't reordain him. Okay. So it's a little bit different situation with us than it is with either Anglicans or other Protestants. The Church of Rome does not recognize their bodies as churches, which is why Vatican II calls them ecclesial bodies. It doesn't call them a church. It calls us a church. So we have valid sacraments by Catholic lights. And I think that puts us in a better position. I don't think that we would reciprocate that with Rome, because I think our understanding of validity is more fine-grained. My understanding is that they have basically a two-step notion of validity and regularity, or licitness. whereas ours would be 3-step, right? So it's the rite has to be legitimate, and then the question of whether the rite is sacramentally efficacious. In Catholic theology, my understanding is that validity and sacramental efficacy go together, right? So if it's valid, then it's sacramentally efficacious. That means if you get the sacrament, it actually does what it's supposed to do.
Right.
My understanding from an Orthodox point of view is that if you were baptized Roman Catholic, for example, and then you're received in the Orthodox Church, the sacrament of chrismation fulfills anything that was lacking or makes your baptism sacramentally efficacious at that point. That's my understanding. I could be mistaken.
That's clearly that's clearly the understanding of the Church of Russia and perhaps some other Orthodox churches. There's a lot of debate, nuance there, and it's interesting to note, by the way, Perry, that when the Church of Russia receives a Roman Catholic priest, they receive him by vesting. There's no baptism, there's no chrismation or anything like that. They receive him by vesting. So it's a very interesting.
I'm aware of that practice by the Russians. I don't think the Greeks have always reciprocated, but I think that's an issue that needs to be further discussed. But I don't think it's clear cut that we like just carte blanche accept, Catholic sacraments kind of freestanding outside the church as sacramentally, efficacious. So I think it would be interesting to see like contrast, just as a point of discussion, contrast, if it's possible, how the reception of Coptic clergy and the reception of Roman clergy. Right, because you have theological issues on both for both of those that we dissent from. But I don't want to get us off track. One thing I will say though is in favor of the Orthodox is that we have preserved the ministry of the church under massive persecution for centuries that Western churches really don't have any experience of. So, we have maintained that faithfulness there in holding on to the threefold ministry and maintaining a tradition when it would be very easy under Islamic rule or even under communist rule to give that up. So I think that's one thing that speaks in our favor is the massive amounts of martyrs, clergy and lay who are willing to go to their deaths rather than renounce some of these things. And even in the face of Protestant missionaries later on, they were unwilling to renounce these things. So I think in that way, as a persecuted church, that gives our church a kind of credibility. Now, this isn't to say that other people haven't suffered, right? Missionaries have suffered and things like that, but they haven't suffered 300 years under Islamic rule or 70 years under communist rule as an institution, and they haven't suffered it completely, right? So I think that's something to be said in our favor.
Yeah, let's why don't we talk a little bit about, I know in the past you shared, which is such an important point, you've mentioned that apostolic succession is a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient one. And I think that's important for even non-Orthodox people to understand, because a lot of times some people may feel a little squirmish about apostolic succession and say, hey, well, just because, okay, you guys have a line that dates back to the apostles, like you guys obviously have in history, but what if things went off the rail, back in the day, or, all kinds of crazy conspiracies that you guys probably have heard. But can you speak a little bit to that and explain more about it being a necessary condition? I know you touched up on it a little bit, but yeah, it being a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one.
Yeah, so it's necessary for what constitutes a minister, but there's also, as I said, the conveyance of right doctrine. And so in terms of things going off the rail, any student of church history will be knowledgeable that there have been heresies in the church, right? We had the Arian heresy, we had the Nestorian heresy,
Right.
We have a variety of different heresies that the church has combated, and some of which fostered by her own ministers. And they were judged by their brother bishops and deposed. And that's generally how the process works. So you have a kind of conciliar model where you have a system of interlocking bishops that keep each other accountable, and they can put other bishops on trial. And this is exactly historically what has happened. So to go back, though, to the earlier part, we need to make clear it's not just a line of dudes.
Right.
Right?
That's true.
It's a continuity of ministry commissioned by Christ and the apostles. So the claim is that we have the ministry and the divine power and authority of Christ and the apostles, right? To minister, to keep the church in perpetuity till the end of time. And so if you believe that the whole church can apostatize, and that the ministry that Christ set up will fail or can fail, then you're going to have a difficulty with the New Testament, because the New Testament precludes, I believe, that from happening. The faith is once for all delivered to the saints, as Jude says. Christ says that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. If your thesis is that the gates of hell have prevailed against the church, you're going to have to do one of two things. You're going to have a premise. Your starting premise needs to be Jesus was wrong, and I think it's game over at that point. Or you're going to go with what I call X-Files ecclesiology, and I realize X-Files isn't as popular as it used to be, but the church is just out there magically somewhere, right? It's this disembodied, non-public entity. It's everywhere in general, but nowhere in particular. That's
visible
not
church.
Yeah, it's the invisible church. That's not New Testament ecclesiology, right? The New Testament the church has public ministers who were known. Their ordination was known. Their commissioning was known. There were marks of what made somebody a member of the church and what did not make somebody a member of the church. St. Paul is very clearly able to exclude people from the kingdom of God. He says, I've handed so-and-so over to Satan so that he may learn not to blaspheme. That means Paul had the authority to remove people out of the church. That doesn't fit very well with the Protestant doctrine of election, which is really the basis for the Protestant notion of the indivisible and the visible church. In the early church, that distinction was between the church on earth and the church that had deceased, right? The people that were awaiting the final judgment. It wasn't between the elect and people who were not elect, and you couldn't tell who was who, and they were just kind of all mixed together on earth. So I think, to get back direct to your question, it has to include the transmission of right doctrine. The right doctrine comes through the apostolic ministry. Other ministers can sit as judges on other ministers in the church, namely bishops. So I think that's how you keep things from going off the rails. And then the other thing is you have the promises of Christ and the New Testament. If you don't believe those, then you don't. It's a rejection of Christ, or you've got to come up with some other theory.
Right.
And you're still then endorsing some kind of apostasy thesis, right? The church fell away. I don't think that those are historically defensible. I don't think they're biblically defensible either.
Right.
So,
well, we have
that's
to kind
how
of
I
go
would answer that question.
And that's a good answer, Perry. And we've been talking a lot in defense of apostolic succession so far by quoting scripture. Well, I often like to point people in the direction of something Paul said to Timothy. Timothy, my son, what I've taught you, teach to other men, so that they can teach other men. So you've got Paul, a first generation Christian, teaching Timothy, a second generation. Timothy's meant to teach the third generation, so the third generation could teach the fourth generation. That's how I interpret that particular passage, and I think I'm right there. But if we were to move that conversation into that third and fourth and subsequent generations, we're talking about the patristic era, the apostolic fathers, and the patristic era that followed. what is the patristic understanding of apostolic succession? What did the early church fathers say about this? What's their witness and testimony?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of material there.
Overwhelming.
And you do have a kind of development, but I don't think it's the kind of development that Protestant scholars think is actually taking place. And we'll talk, I think, more about this later. But the primary sources we have are the Didache, or the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, which is written sometime between 70 and 120 AD at the latest, I think. We have the epistles of Polycarp, or letters to Polycarp. Polycarp was a disciple of John the Apostle, who was a bishop. We have most famously the epistles of Ignatius of Antioch, who was ordained by Peter and Paul. I don't think you get any better than being ordained. Like, the next up is Jesus, right? Like, you don't get any better. And Ignatius was a martyr in Rome. He was taken to Rome and eaten by lions. So he held a confession to the point of death, and there's nothing grossly objectionable unless you just reject his teaching outright. There's no flubs or serious errors in his work that would impugn his reputation. So Ignatius says, for example, in his epistle to the Trallians, and this is just a sample, there's stuff all over the place. In like manner, let all reverence the deacons as an appointment of Jesus Christ, the bishop as Jesus Christ, who is Son of the Father, and the presbyters as the Sanhedrin of God and the assemblies of the apostles. Apart from these, there is no church. Right?
Wow.
Ignatius
very clear.
is very clear. A number of places he says, don't do anything without the bishop. Anybody who does things apart from the bishop or celebrates apart from the bishop is not part of the church. You need to maintain the unity of the church. Clement, for example, who was a bishop in Rome, writes about how the bishops represent the high priests, and that this threefold order came from the Old Testament. It is now continuing in the New Testament, but under the New Covenant. You have Irenaeus of Lyon. In around 180, he has a very clear statement about the succession of ministers, the bishops as successors to the ministry of the apostles. And this is very important for Irenaeus in his book Against Heresies, which is very long. But it's important for this reason, because he's dealing with the Gnostics who are claiming to have a secret tradition that wasn't even given to all the apostles. It was only given to certain apostles that they claim to have. Okay. And they would revise the biblical books based on their understanding. So they would generally reject the Old Testament and parts of the New Testament. They had a favorite for Luke and some of Paul's epistles. They favored those. And they would just come up with these wild interpretations. So let me give you an example of a Gnostic interpretation to give you a flavor. So we have the biblical passage that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Right? And we read that and be like, okay, if you fear God, okay, that's the beginning of understanding, right? You pay attention. Okay. The Gnostic interpretation is possessive, that it was the Lord's fear. The Lord was fearful of somebody else, another God above him. And then he began to understand, because they had this cosmology that the God who created the world was this lesser God who was an imperfect creator, who had an ego problem, which they identified with the deity of the Old Testament. So to combat this, Irenaeus appeals to the ministers of the apostles and the successors of the apostles. And he talks about this as a way to combat Gnosticism. And basically what he says is, look, if you want to know what the apostles said, you can go to the churches that we know that they personally founded and where they left the faith there. And where all these churches agree, okay, that's going to be the apostles' teaching. And he says this, even if we didn't have the scriptures, we could still know what the apostles taught through the ministry of the ministry of the churches the apostles founded. Right. And he says, furthermore, that the reason why this is important is that he's not advocating a form of sola scriptura, very clearly, right? Because he thinks we can know what the apostolic teaching is, even if we didn't have the scriptures. And he says that the Gnostics don't have any of these ministers, and they don't have any of these churches, right? Now, the objection will come back, and we need to deal with this because it always comes back, that Irenaeus made a mistake and thought that Jesus was in his 40s or up to 50 years old when he was.
Man, they love that one.
Yeah. Well, number one, that's the only error that they're going to pick out. Okay. If they have some other errors that they want to throw out to impugn his credibility, go for it. One, it undermines their own case for the veracity of Scripture, because Irenaeus is one of our witnesses to the authorship of the Gospels.
Yep.
We don't have gospel manuscripts prior to 200 to 250 AD that designate the author of that. We rely on church tradition to know that. So if you want to say that these people are not reliable conveyors of information, you
shoot yourself in the foot.
You shoot yourself in the foot. Something else I forgot to mention about the apostolic ministry, I think it's 1 John 4:6. In John's epistle, John says that this is how we know the difference between the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. Those who listen to us, right, have the Spirit of God. And those who do not have the Spirit, do not listen to us, do not have the Spirit. That's how you know the difference between truth and error, is if you listen to the apostolic ministers, not if you crack open your Bible and you measure everything the church says by your own judgment as if you were on an authoritative par with the church, because you're not. It's John locates the authority in the apostolic ministry. So it's clearly, I would say it's not a case of sola scriptura there, but I had forgotten that. But I wanted to make sure to press that point. The other thing with Irenaeus is this. Irenaeus gives you a method for knowing what is from the apostles and what isn't. You go to the churches that the apostles founded and where they all agree. That's the uncontroversial apostolic teaching. Okay, so Irenaeus does not claim infallibility for himself, so we can just use his own test to say, okay, he made a mistake on that point of Jesus being in his 40s. Given the lack of clarity on the birth of Jesus at that time, it's not completely, it's not completely outlandish. If Jesus is born somewhere between 7 to 10 AD or BC, then that's going to add some time on it. And there are particular theological reasons and rhetorical reasons why Irenaeus argues that way. I'm not saying he's right, but it's not completely like stupid.
Right.
The other thing is to recognize is Irenaeus is historically reliable. One error does not make him historically unreliable. So the Protestants need to prove more than he made just that one mistake. We have manuscripts of the Bible which have copy errors in them, right? We have longer and shorter readings of various books. We have copy errors. This is not to impugn the veracity of the Bible in any way. It is to point out, though, that we have a methodology for sifting those out and getting to a critical text that very accurately represents the original. We don't say, oh, this New Testament copy has an error, so now we don't believe anything the New Testament says.
Right.
Well, why would you do that with Irenaeus? It's the fallacy of special pleading, right? You have a methodology to sift errors, right? You have multiple methodologies to do that. So it's just kind of ad hoc and special pleading that you do this for the New Testament and other historical documents, but you don't do this for Irenaeus. So, I wanted to address that because that's always brought up, and I really don't think it's a good counter argument.
Yeah, right.
So there's lots of things in Ignatius. There's a side note. Ignatius's epistles were seen as such strong testimony for apostolic succession and episcopacy that the Reformed writers launched a veritable army to prove that they were inauthentic and spurious. And it wasn't until Pearson, who was an Anglican scholar, British scholar, I think in the 18th century, that decisively proved that the core of the epistles were authentic. And that pretty much settled the debate. There are longer and shorter versions, and then there are scholars like J.B. Lightfoot have come and taken and put them, sifted them, and come up with a general text. But even if you read the shorter recensions of Ignatius' epistles, they don't fit with Presbyterian theology. They don't fit with Baptist congregational polity. They're not long. They're all on the internet. You can go read them at cccl.org or somewhere else like that. They're not long. Just read them and ask yourself, does this sound like your Presbyterian or Baptist church? Because I think the answer is going to be no. And I don't think it sounds like a Lutheran church either, because the Lutherans really don't have apostolic succession or episcopacy either. So we could talk about the Lutherans as a separate issue, because they have kind of their own unique situation. But I think there's plenty of material, and there are going to be objections, and we can talk about some of those. But I think there's plenty of material in the Didache, Polycarp, Ignatius, Clement, Irenaeus, Tertullian, even though he's not a church father, he is an early Christian witness, Origen. I think the most important question to ask when we're looking at these sources is how much evidence should we expect to find between 70 AD and 200?
Right.
Christianity is illegal. The church is being persecuted. You're not going to go down to the copy store and have something copied down. There's no postal service, right? Only wealthy people can afford to send letters. To give you an idea, military transmission of information from one end of the empire to the other, from say Judea to Rome, could take 3 weeks. And that was fast. That was incredibly fast. So the only way to get it there faster, I mean, maybe by ship, but most ships did not go by direct route because they went along the coast because it was safer. So you need to ask yourself, how much data should we expect to find? Okay. And the answer, I think, reasonably is not much. We don't even get complete text of the Bible until the 3rd, 4th century. Secondly, how much discussion should we expect to find of a given theory of church government, right? They're writing to people who already know stuff. So why would you give the basics to them already? You shouldn't expect to find a how-to manual of how to set up your local parish. Right. That's all done verbally. So sometimes what happens is you have critics who will say, well, this doesn't mention the theory, so therefore he didn't believe in it. Well, that would be a fallacy of ignorance. You can't conclude from the lack of mention that they didn't believe it. You can't draw a negative conclusion that way. All you can say is they didn't mention it, right? And then the question is, well, how much should they mention? And so in sifting data and assessing whether data actually functions as evidence for a thesis, you need to keep in mind, how much data should we expect to find, and what should we expect them to say? Right? Something else is a kind of pushback. We have no examples, 0 examples of Presbyterian ordination by presbyters in the early church until the 4th century. We have no clear case of congregational polity in the early church. None. Or Presbyterian ordination. So you don't have presbyters ordaining other presbyters. And when it does happen in the 4th century, the church roundly condemns it. And their answer is, who's ever heard of such a thing that a presbyter would try to ordain? This is crazy. These people are clearly nuts. So all the cases we have of ordination in the early church are episcopal ordination or ordination from bishops. So all the evidence is ours. They have no uncontroversial evidence. Okay. So these would be things outside the New Testament that I would point to, that I think make a very strong case when you keep in mind those historical parameters for assessing data, right? You can't conclude that they didn't hold something because they don't mention it, or they don't write in the See Jesus Run form of writing. They're not writing like Dr. Seuss, right? It's not, well, Jesus never said, quote, I am God, period. Like, okay, that's kind of lame, right? People don't, that's setting the bar so high that no historical source could meet it. That's not good historiography. That's not good historical methodology. We don't do that with any other kind of text. So, and New Testament scholars don't do this with the New Testament. So I think we need to keep those parameters in mind. So what do we have? We have people talking about bishops and deacons, and then bishops, presbyters, and deacons, and that bishops are only ordaining. We don't have any example of presbyters ordaining, right? So what does that look like? You shouldn't expect a full-blown theory. You don't even get a full-blown theory of in terms of formal spelling out of the Trinity until the 4th century. Now, did the early church believe the Trinity? Absolutely. But you don't have formal technical vocabulary until there's a serious challenge. So I think we should, given the paucity of sources, we should expect the same thing here.